Hi, everybody. I'm Kay Helm, and this is the Your Voice podcast. Find your voice, tell your story, change the world. Each week, I interview someone about the way in which they live or tell their story. And this week, my guest is Allison Mayer. She's a humanitarian, photojournalist, and a witness. Allison, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's so great to sit down and talk with you.
Yeah, we've chatted a little bit on Facebook before, but it's going to be really nice to have a conversation. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Absolutely. So like you said, I'm a humanitarian photojournalist, which is a really long kind of fancy title that no one understands unless I explain it to them anyway. So basically what it means is I work with nonprofit organizations and NGOs across the world to help collect media and stories, mostly for fundraising, sometimes for awareness, so that they have the information and the media content they need to go out and promote their message and spread the help that they're doing to more people across their organization, whatever countries they may be in. So I use a combined method of like traditional journalism and a written storytelling with photography, which is my true passion, and a little bit of video here and there to consult with organizations and create complete marketing plans. I work mostly with small to medium organizations that don't necessarily have their own marketing team. So I'll come on at the very beginning of a project, at the very beginning of a fundraising idea, and kind of consult with them to build the story all the way from its conception to the actual implementation of the fundraising.
What do you look for when you arrive somewhere? I know you've already done some homework, I'm sure, and you've had those conversations with the organization, but can you walk us through what that process would be like?
Yeah, definitely. So like you said, I've already met with the organization and we have an idea what we're looking for, but I do try to go into it with kind of an open mind and let the environment and the people share their stories with me and kind of let that determine, having in the back of my mind these markers that we've set forward for things that we want to highlight. How do those stories fit in? So I like tell people I go on any trip to make friends first, and I'm a photographer second. So I don't come in like with my camera ready to shoot. Like I'm just part of the organization, taking in the surroundings. I never photograph anybody without their permission. I never photograph anybody without kind of a cursory understanding, at least, of their story ahead of time. So to me, it's all about making that connection and really treating everybody I meet with the respect that they deserve to decide whether or not they want to be part of sharing this story. So a lot of times that trust builds very quickly because I'm with people in an organization that already have those foundations of friendship built. Mm-hmm. Depending on where you go and who you're speaking with, it can be harder to build relationships, especially with telling stories of women in a lot of countries. A lot of times our translators are male, and if it's not Haiti or someplace where they speak Spanish, then I can't talk for myself. I have to work through a translator. But you encounter different obstacles, and I find a lot of times if you just come to the person first and say, hey, I just want to get to know you, they're a lot more receptive to allowing those details about the struggles and the things that unfortunately raise the most money for organizations come forward in their stories. So I don't ever want to approach somebody with the idea that we need you to tell the most dramatic, most like deeply hurtful story ever. I want people to authentically share what they feel is their life. And a lot of times we can look at somebody who's raising 6 kids without a husband in like a dirt shack in the middle of nowhere without running water and think their story must be so tragic. And then when you talk to them, they're just like the happiest, most carefree people. Like they understand they have a struggle, but to them, their story is not tragic. And it's about finding a balance between how can I successfully collect media and information that helps people here in the US understand without further victimizing or exploiting or pigeonholing this person into something that they feel like they're not.
Yeah, and you talk about exploiting people, as that's always a possibility when you're going with the purpose of raising money, mm-hmm. and you're using somebody's story to do that.
Yeah.
And you have a hashtag on your Instagram. It says hashtag stop pornography with POOR in the middle. Tell us what that means.
Sure. So a lot of times you might also hear it referred to as like poverty porn or war porn. They're all kind of in the same general concept. And what that basically refers to is images of people, of events that are taken out of context, that are exploited to show like the most graphic, the most horrific detail that you can. You know, images of like a starving child on the side of the road, like eating through trash with no care given to who that person is. The person who took the photo may or may not even know that child's name, or may not know that child's circumstances. It could be that this is a one-time thing that's happened and they don't know because they just saw this snapshot that they want to represent the worst of the worst in order to elicit the most I don't even want to say empathy or sympathy as much as I don't know what the right word is for it, but to get the most visceral reaction from people here in the US. We become such desensitized to media that it has to get progressively graphic and progressively violent and progressively heartbreaking for us to even take notice. And I think a lot of that is that the stories aren't collected to go along with these things. Like, you may see an image of a happy baby in some place like Haiti, for example. You're not going to think twice, but if you read a story that goes along with that, that connects you, that helps you understand that you as a mother in the US have the same struggles as this mother in Haiti, that image becomes so much more powerful and so much more of a realistic look into what it is than just this exploitive image that was taken by somebody without any care or regard for who that person was and what story they're labeling this person with.
The thought that came to mind as you were describing that is, does it divide us or does it bring us closer? It might be a good way to judge an image.
Yeah, I think 100% divisive images are what sells. And I think that's highly unfortunate. And I know a lot of times I have peers who ask me, like, why don't you just get a job with CNN? Like, you'd make so much more money, or you'd get to go so many more places, or it'd be so much more easier. But if I worked for CNN or for NBC or Reuters or whatever, like, I don't have the ability to then say no to things. And I do. A lot of times I'll be approached by organizations that do things that are counterintuitive to what I feel in my experience is the best way to help. So a lot of organizations that bring huge amounts of donations into an area without regard for the jobs that are being destroyed, I don't work with those organizations. And being freelance, being on my own, I have the ability to say no to that. But then I also have the ability to educate them. I also have the ability to say, I understand why you're doing this. I understand that you're trying to help, but let me introduce you to some of these alternatives that I've seen working in the past. And I think that gives a lot more care and dignity and specifically ownership of the stories back to the people who are featured in them, the people whose lives these stories actually are. It's so important to me that they maintain the ownership of their story. They have the right to say, share it, don't share it, portray me this way, don't portray me this way. And it's perfectly okay if they don't want any part of your trying to elicit pity from people in the US.
Yeah, that's strong. And that's, we did a child sponsorship program for several years. And I woke up one night in the middle of the night, I mean, just bolted upright with this thought of, we're handing out photographs of children to strangers with their story, with the child's story. The child's mom doesn't even have a picture of that child. You know, and it all of a sudden, it turned the way I felt around about the program, and it just made me start asking questions. And I was the one that launched the thing, you know. So it's not, it was just, you're trying to figure out sometimes, especially when you're starting out, how do I tell the stories? And you start telling them the way you've always seen them told. But I think then the more we really build relationship, and you started with talking about how important it is to build relationship with people. If you value relationships with people, and think about, would I do this with my friends?
I think nobody goes into the nonprofit sector with malicious intent. Nobody goes to another country and says, I don't think even people understand that they're coming in kind of with like a savior complex. It's just not something people realize until you've been there and you've done it and you understand the mistakes that you've made. That's why I'm so outspoken in the stories that I do share on my own personal account and when I work with other organizations about kind of explaining why the pieces of stories are important. So like on my Instagram, for example, I alternate between actual stories of people, the kind of content that you would expect me to produce if I were working with your organization, and then kind of behind the scenes stories that explain how I got that picture or why I feel that picture is important or what I feel is the mistake that is made so often. One of the things I like to tell people, I don't know if it's quite as relatable as it was a couple of years ago, but there was this photo that was floating around of this girl that had escaped from Syria. She was a refugee. None of the captions made any indication of like her name or where the photo was taken. She was covered in dirt, had like blood dripping down from her face. And then I have it on my Facebook, and I should probably put this on my Instagram story. It's a good reminder. I have it on my Facebook beside a picture of Anne Frank and talk about how in the 1940s, like this was a perfectly acceptable, you know, growing up in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, whatever, learning about the Holocaust, learning about everything that happened. This pretty, like, pristine, nice portrait of this girl was a perfectly acceptable representation of somebody who needed our help. And today in 2018, like, we wouldn't even look twice at that photo. Like, we need to see the blood and the gore and the tragedy and all of these things that don't define who that little girl is and where her life is going to go, just for us to even care. And I think that's a sad commentary, not only on where our media is going, but where humanity is headed, because we control what we see. We can talk all day long about how we don't want to see these graphically violent images, but the reason they keep being put up there is because we keep looking at them. And we have a responsibility to say, when we see something that crosses that line, that's not okay. I don't want that to be a representation of how I'm being fed news from around the world.
And I know some places will, you know, if they are documenting an event, a bombing or a disaster of some sort, and there are some disturbing images, they'll black that out.
Yeah, it's becoming less and less common, though.
Yeah,
I still remember the very first time I saw a dead body on TV, and it was in 2007 when I was living in Boston, and somebody had been shot, and like they showed like the guy on the ground with his feet sticking out of the white sheet, and I was horrified. I was like, why are we seeing this on TV? And now that's such a tame image. Like, that wouldn't even probably tick off my radar anymore like it did at that moment.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you, you have another hashtag. I'm kind of doing the hashtag tour of your Instagram.
My shirt actually has hashtags on it, and my friends are always like, are people supposed to tap on those? And I'm like, no, please don't touch me. So talking hashtags all you want, that's how I speak, so I'm good with that.
Okay. Yeah, and I would encourage you to, if you are not driving while you're listening to this podcast, you need to go right now to Instagram.com/Allison Mayer WSA. So, and we'll have the link in the show notes too, so you can click on it there and look at these images, but don't just stop at looking at the images. And I'm going to come back to the hashtag question here in a second, because Allison really writes some stories and asks some really serious questions. You bring up a lot of really wonderful conversations in your Instagram, but coming back to the hashtag question, I want to ask you, you have hashtag witness. What does it mean to be a witness?
All right. So on my Instagram, the WSA stands for Witness, Storyteller, Artist. And that's kind of how I define myself, and in that order, which to some people is a little surprising because I am a photographer by trade originally. I got into this field through photography, but photography has become kind of just a tool or secondary to what I really do. And so I really feel like my first and foremost responsibility is to be a witness. Whether I take a photo or not, whether I write anything down or not, Like, I am present in that moment with that person to say, I see your life. Like, I see who you are. I see what your dreams are, what your aspirations are, what your struggles are. I see you as a human. I see you as if you're a Christian, as I am, I see you as a fellow child of God. I see you as somebody who deserves dignity and respect. And that can be where it ends sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't go into the storytelling and it doesn't even make it to the photography. But the witness part is the most important to me. And I think that we all have that responsibility. And even if you don't travel often, if you're relying on people like me to bring you back stories, you have a responsibility to be authentic in the way that you're consuming that person's story and in the way that you're relating to that person's story. And remember, first and foremost, that this is not your story. This is not your cause to champion. This is not your thing to push forward or try to fix. Your only responsibility in reading the story is to recognize the person behind it. So I always approach everything as a witness first. And then we move kind of into the storytelling as the relationship develops. I think it's the second kind of key point into what I do. Once I understand who you are and what your story is, once I understand your struggles and where possibly I might know of resources to help, or I might know of organizations that could benefit you and benefit from your story, that's when I'll kind of dig a little deeper and say, okay, how did we get here? What are the events in your life that led to this point? What do you want to do from here? I think that's the part that gets left out the most. Is a lot of people do go, storytelling is becoming a big buzzword, especially in marketing lately. But I find that a lot of times the thing that's left out of the story is the what comes next. People get the here's the problem, here's how we can help, and how do we get here? But they leave out the part that's important to all of us, like the hope of the future, the what comes next, the how can I benefit from this service that a nonprofit is providing, but also how is my life going to go on even if I don't benefit from that service? Because the sum of their humanity and their story and their dignity is not tied up in whether or not they work with this organization. Their life will still exist outside of that. So I really do focus on the future. And then the artist part is obviously self-explanatory in the photography. So that's just kind of my communication language. How I best connect with the world is through visual media. I do a lot of writing, and I think my writing gets the point across, but the photography is definitely finding the right image to convey the right message without exploiting the person. Every single image is exploitive in some way. There's just no way around it. It's the way photography works. But without exploiting them too much or without pigeonholing them too much, any images that don't allow for a person to have a future. Like, I am 100% against images of people who are dead and or about to die, like in their moment of like dying or of death, because it just doesn't allow for them, if they've already died, to say, yes, you're okay to share my story. Or if they're in their moment of dying, it just doesn't allow for that future that they may have. So
that's good. You've got a picture here. I'm looking at your Instagram account now, and there's a photograph. It's just a person's foot. There looks like they're maybe sitting on a bench, and there's a rocky ground. It's a black and white, and they're wearing an old plastic shoe.
A Croc.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
they're wearing Crocs.
And it's been cracked and sewn back together.
Yeah.
Tell me about that picture.
Sure. So this is actually from my very first trip ever. This was taken in September of 2012 when I went to Haiti for the first time. And I think it's such a special image to me for so many reasons. To begin with, it's it very perfectly captures my experience of that first trip. So when I went to Haiti for the first time, I'm a researcher, like I'm a reader, I'm a consumer of media. I read the news articles and reviewed the history and learned all about Haiti before I got there. And then I arrived at this country that was completely foreign to everything that I was expecting. Like, I was expecting this like dirty, sad, depressing, like lonely, tragic place. And yes, it was shortly after the earthquake, and they're still not even done rebuilding today in 2018, but it was just like a happy, joyous place, like full of life. Everybody had their jobs to do and their families to worry about. And just like you would expect to find here in the US, like people struggling with everyday things that aren't related to this tragic earthquake that had happened. And so we were up in the mountains, like it was like a 6-hour drive, 1 mile up the mountain. Like that's you've been places like that.
Yeah.
And these people are walking around, and I saw this guy. His name's actually Clarence. He was like 84 years old. But he could be anybody, wearing Crocs, which are something that here in the US, like you wear to like the shower or the beach, or you like wear them a couple times, they get dirty, you throw them away. And he was wearing Crocs that obviously he didn't buy in Haiti. They had been brought by some organization. Mm-hmm. They're cracked and falling apart, and he had taken the time to sew them up because they're the only shoes that he has. Right. And you can't walk on that rocky, like hard, jagged ground in your bare feet. And it was just so indicative to me of how something that is trash here in the US, something that we don't value, that we don't care about in the US, has become like this thing that they need, this thing that has like hope and life and a future. And I thought that was just a perfect summary of my experience in Haiti. Like this place that I expected to be like dirty and broken and falling apart, it was in the midst of fixing itself and still becoming something for the future. Like it wasn't done and ready to be discarded. The other thing, the other thing I really like about this image is it's a completely anonymous image that 100% tells a story. And I think a lot of people get focused on people's faces and having to capture somebody's identity in order to share their story. I know a lot of people ask me, because I will be upfront with every organization that I work with, that at any point in time, I am okay with spending 2 hours talking to somebody and having them not give us consent to use their story. Like that's just what happens, and that's their right. And people are like, well, then how are we going to get images to tell the story if we can't use their face or we can't use their words? And like, there's always ways. There's always ways that you can find some small detail, some anonymous image. In this case, I know the person the image was taken of. Like I met him and I spoke with him, but even if I hadn't, I don't want to say it doesn't matter who he is, but it's not his story. His foot in this image is representing the story of a people. It's not traced back to him. It's not exploiting him. It's not saying this is who he is. It's rather representative in a way that you can't get when you take pictures of people's faces, because it boils it down to just them. So there's always ways, there's always alternatives. If you're looking to capture the story in the right way, you find them. And I think that this photo is perfectly indicative of how you find those moments.
What would you say to somebody who's getting ready to go into a new culture? Perhaps they're on a short-term team. They're going to take a camera. You know, everybody's got a phone. Everybody's taking pictures. Mm-hmm. What are some things that they can carry with them, just, you know, mentally, to kind of check and say, are these appropriate images, and where should I share them, and how should I share them? What do I do? How do I approach that?
My best advice to everybody would be just leave your camera at home, but I understand that that's not a practical thing. Like you need images to show the people who donated to your trip and all of that. So I think the thing that people lose sight of the most when they leave another country is the fact that just because they're in another country doesn't mean that there are different rules. Like here in the US, you can't just walk into your neighbor's backyard and like start taking pictures with their kid. Like that's not okay. That's not something you can do. Yet it's something I see on the short-term mission field all of the time. And a lot of times it saddens me. And I know I was totally guilty of this the first couple of times I went before I knew any better.
Me too.
But when you go to villages or you're walking around in some of these places and the kids just run up to you in swarms, and they're just so welcoming and so embracing, and it's hard not to get caught up in that energy. But if you think about it, like that's not a normal reaction for children to have to a stranger. And I think that keeping that in mind, acting like you're here in the US, like would you do this in the US? Would you just go into a school and like sit down and start taking pictures while the teacher is teaching? Like, no, you wouldn't do that. So a lot of it's common sense, but it's hard not to get caught up in that mentality. And all organizations work differently. A lot of times, if you're with team members who live there full time, who interact in the community full time, that does bring a little bit of a different element to it. It's not like you're just walking into like a strange building. But always ask, especially if you're with kids, always ask a parent or an adult or somebody that's around. Maybe that's the team member that you're with. Say, hey, is this okay? Can you tell me a little bit about like who this kid is? Take time to form a bond with the child. I mean, it's so easy. Kids don't care that you don't speak their language. Like, right. Run around and play tag or chase them or like throw rocks or whatever it is that they're doing. Just like participate in their activity. You become a friend, you build that relationship, and it's totally acceptable to take pictures with your friends. But I think a lot of times people are so caught up in that, how do I get the perfect selfie to put on my Facebook, that they lose sight of the fact that they're unintentionally bringing another person's story back with them. That person has a story, and when you just post their face on Facebook without knowing anything about them, you're stripping the humanity away from that image. You're stripping ownership away from their story. So even if you just try to learn their name, you can always learn how to say, what's your name in another language, no matter what it is. It'll be an easy thing. If that's all you learn about them, then kudos to you. Spend some time learning their name, but just act like you're here. Just don't forget like all of your manners and all of your common sense just because you're in another country.
Yeah, and being careful too about what we're revealing about them too, because if you're going to help with vulnerable children, the key word there is vulnerable.
Yes.
And all children are vulnerable, and so identifying where they're at, even what school they're going to, and things about where they live. I can't count the number of times I've seen people come back and post things like, little Joey, has AIDS and his mother died, 3 weeks ago. And here's his picture, there's this, it's like the sadness of the story,
Yeah.
And the person has no intention of harming or manipulating or exposing that child. But would you give that kind of identifiable, information about your own child? Here's my child. They go, well, actually, a lot of times we do, even on Facebook. Here's my child. Yeah. They go to such and such elementary school. They're in Miss So-and-so's class, and
Yeah, I think if that's the one takeaway, is to understand the power that an image and the story can have, regardless of how small it is. Because it is true, there are some things you do here in the U.S. that are not okay to do as well. True. And we can take that behavior with us, and that can translate into working on the short-term mission field. I think the most, take your guidance from the people that are there, that you're working with. So not your short-term mission trip leaders, the people who are on the ground all of the time. They can tell you what's okay and what's appropriate. They know what stories are okay to share and what details are okay to give. And a lot of times it's better, even though the person's name, like you don't necessarily have to publish their name with the image. Right. There is not a single person on my Instagram. Okay. For the most part, there's not anybody on my Instagram. I do have a few like street shots, but for the most part, any identifiable images of people on my Instagram, I know the names of everybody that are there, but I don't always share them. It's not always appropriate. It's not always appropriate to use their name to tie them to a story that may not be representative of their life, even though I am using their image. There's just a lot of factors. Use common sense and take your cues from people that are there. And if you have any questions, if you're concerned, if it doesn't feel right, don't do it. Like if you can't in your mind 100% say this is okay, then just don't post it. The world will go on and everything will be fine.
Yeah. Here's a wonderful example again from your Instagram about using a person's image, and it's really powerful image, and you don't use the name, and it's a woman, and she's got her hands together and she's looking off to the side, and you just want to know, when you see the picture, you just want to know, what's she thinking about? And you just put a quote in the caption says, "We have to pray with our eyes on God, not on the difficulties." It's from Oswald Chambers. And you just leave that there for us. But it's so powerful.
The thing about this image is how perfectly that quote, even though they're not my words, how perfectly that quote sums up this image and like my experience of that image. So I have a tattoo on my forearm that says "Always No Hope." And the words came from this woman, Christine. Somebody had, in our interview with her, had asked her, she lost 7 family members in the earthquake. And somebody had asked her, how do you move forward? How do you keep going on? I didn't speak Haitian Creole at the time, so we were relying on our translator. I don't know if she said, "I always know hope," like KNOW, instead of "I always have hope," or if the translator's English was bad. All I know is like those 3 words have kind of become like my mantra and have kind of stuck with me. And to her, she said, "I always know hope. I just keep my eyes focused on God. And I know that He has a better life planned for me and that there's a purpose in everything that happens." So yeah, even though I didn't share all of those details, like you still got that message in that story.
Yeah, it comes through. And that's one of the things that I really love. Again, go to Allison's Instagram, follow her, because you're just going to be full of all these smiling faces and stories, and it's powerful. And so it's such a mix of joy and heartache on this page.
Yeah, there are stories on there that are tough, that are hard to tell. I do have an image of Emmanuel, who is a kid that I met in Haiti in 2015. He came into the malnutrition program where I was working, and he ended up dying a week later from like a low-grade fever because he didn't have access to Tylenol. And it's just one of those stories that like I feel so passionate about sharing, but it's hard to find a good way to share it. Because I do try to focus on the happy, on the positive. And I do that a lot because when these stories happen, where something as needlessly tragic as this little boy dying from a lack of Tylenol, something we all have in our medicine cabinets, like I want you to focus on that. I want you to see that. I want you to notice the distinct difference between this needlessly tragic and sad thing that has happened, but amidst like all of the joy and all of the life goes on that happens in the country. So I take these are probably the stories I struggle over the most, the ones that like I put the most like blood and sweat and tears into trying to decide what to share, because they are so important. And the truth is, if I were sharing things every single day about that, like y'all wouldn't care anymore. And that's sad, because you should, but it's a balance between choosing what is representative, because people aren't dying every day like in the middle of the street in Haiti like people would lead you to believe, or any other country. I use Haiti as an example a lot because I've been there the most. But it's not constant tragedy, and that's all you see is this happened, this hurricane happened. And so I don't want my stories to be constant tragedy either. So I kind of try to have a balance there. But even then, you'll see like the images that I did choose to share of him are not like the most, this person looks like they're on their deathbed images that I could have found. They're a balance between he was fine, he was getting better, and then this thing happened. So.
And that's what life is. I mean, we have the moments of, and I've heard it described this way too. You think maybe the ups and downs of life as if they come sequentially, but they often come side by side. The joy and the heartache together, and I think that's what we see in your storytelling, in your this page here that acts as a witness, like you say. I love that, what you had to say about being a witness.
Well, I'm glad that comes through, because I try very hard at making that come through. You're talking about like the stories coming side by side. So that week that I was in the malnutrition clinic where I met Emmanuel, there was also this little girl, Quintiana, who came in, and she was this tiny little premature. She was like 2 months old, but still smaller than a newborn. The details are on my Instagram. I don't remember exactly how much she weighed, but just tiny, like you could hold her in the palm of your hand. And within like 3 months, like she's up to normal weight and healthy and bouncing around. And they both came into the clinic as new patients at the same time. And then they had those two separate results. And they were the opposite of what you expect. Like Emmanuel should have been fine and Quintiana should have struggled. And you just never know what life's going to throw at you. And that's one reason that I try not to have a preconceived notion of what stories I want to capture when I go somewhere, because those things do happen where I might have in an earlier time in my career when I didn't have much experience, like gone into that story expecting to capture like a tragic story of like this little girl who was so malnourished that there was no hope. And that's not what that story was. And if I had allowed myself to have that preconceived notion, I wouldn't have gotten some of the details and some of the images that I did get, because I was just letting the story unfold in the way that it was happening, regardless of what the outcome may be. So.
Well, Allison, is there something you want us to make sure that we remember?
I always tell people if you take away anything from what I say, it's to remember that media is powerful. Every single image you look at is a snapshot of somebody's story. And the photographer who took it or you, the viewer, get to decide, is that all that story is, or is there more? And with that comes a responsibility that when you see media that's inappropriate, you do not engage with it. Like, I think a lot of our tendencies are to comment on media and be like, this is terrible. The internet doesn't care if you left bad feedback or good feedback. All clicks are clicks. It doesn't matter why you clicked or why you shared. Don't engage with bad media, and do celebrate the people that you find that are telling good stories, that are telling respectful stories. Get those out there. Like, get that share on your feed, on your Instagram, on your Facebook, with your friends in real life, and emails that you send from news articles, say, this is media I support and this is media that's not okay, because your opinion does make a difference. It does matter what you see and what you click on. And if you're like me and you want to see the tides and how we tell stories shift to more dignified, more celebrated, more accurate, authentic media, then you need to be the person that pushes that media forward and lets the other media fall by the wayside. So, and that doesn't just go for nonprofits. That includes like celebrity photos of like body parts slipping out of their dresses and everything. Like, don't share those either. Right. Don't be like, oh, this is so disgusting. I can't believe someone took this picture. Just ignore it and like move on with your life and celebrate the good media that is out there. And it will slowly start to make a difference if enough of us are diligent about asking the right questions and investigating the right stories.
There you go. Allison, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was super fun.
Yeah. Make sure that you check out the show notes at yourvoicepodcast.com. All the links we talk about are there. So especially, please check out that Instagram account. You will be very glad if you follow Allison and her stories. Please consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. That will help other people find the show. I'm Kay Helm. Until next week, this is the Your Voice Podcast. Find your voice, tell your story, change the world.